Okay, now we're going to create a method in this repository. It is going to be of type future because it's going to be making an API request and it needs to, it's not going to happen instantly. Similarly, we're going to have a list of quote model, also optional called quotes. So we need a block listener now. This will be listening to our state, and we need to tell Dart what this is. It is of type quote block, and specifically the kind of state, quote state. All right, welcome to this new series. We will be building a Lord of the Rings companion app. I'm excited because I do really like Lord of the Rings. It's great, great set of films, great books, all that kind of stuff. Um, the uh, the reason that I think this is going to be a cool project is we're going to be dealing with a lot of very common patterns that happen in any state management API driven apps. What we're going to be doing is integrating with this free to use API, the one API.dev. You can check out the documentation and create an account by going to the one API.dev website. So this is a pretty standard API, RESTful API, where we can get data. There's no ability to do post requests or puts or deletes or anything like that. It's read only as it should be, because otherwise people could just update stuff and the data would become incorrect. Um, there are some issues I do have with this API in terms of some of the ways the data is structured, but for the purpose of this, it's going to be perfectly fine. And we may, after this series, kind of do a second follow-up series where we actually look into the server-side part of this more and maybe make our own adjustments to it and sort of our own API and update the app. We'll see if how well this series is received and if there's any interest in doing that. So, sort of to get started, I have the docs open here. You do have to create an account to get your API token right there. This is just telling you need an API token, which you can get by once you create an account, you go into your account settings and you'll see it. So they give you some, it's pretty light documentation, but it's enough to kind of figure it out for yourself. Essentially, they have a few different resources. They have book, movie, character, and quote, and chapter, I suppose. We're going to be mostly focusing on character and quote, and then a little bit on movie as well. So that we can kind of tie a bunch of things together. We're not going to worry about the books, but if you are following along and want to kind of go above and beyond, of course, like instead of maybe using the movies as the root, use the books, use the chapters, that kind of stuff. You'll see in here that what we end up building, there's a lot of repetition between the different resources because they follow a similar pattern. Further than that, aside from hitting these resources, they have a few different things like pagination, which we'll be touching on. So, we don't want to, there's a lot of characters in Lord of the Rings. We don't want to hit an endpoint and get all, however many thousands they have in this database. We'd only want to get, maybe 20 at a time and paginate. There's also abilities to sort things. And then there's also filtering. And we will be touching on some filtering and do some search further on in this. So that's kind of where we're at now. For this series, we're going to be, if you watched my last one for state management, we went a pretty simple approach using sort of similar patterns to provider, which is good for kind of doing one-off things. But we're going to be using block, the block pattern in here, which is one of the go-tos, especially on database-driven applications. Okay, so we're just gonna get started. I have my terminal here. I am going to essentially do Flutter create, we'll call it Lord of the Rings, just all one word, and I'll underscore with Flutter, just in case if we have another project, we might want to call it something different. This is specifically the Flutter one. So we're gonna run that, and we're gonna go into that project. Wow. And we are going to open it in VS Code. Having a bit of a problem opening it. Visual Studio Code, no. Let's just open code. And we're just going to go back and find that folder because it wasn't opening like I'd expect. Right, yes, I trust these authors. The author is me. Okay, so we have this open. I am going to zoom it a bit so that people can kind of see. And let's open up our main Dart. And let's just, as long as we're in a Dart file, we can do Control F5. Make sure that you have this set to simulator or whatever you want to build to. This would, in theory, work with Mac, would work with Chrome, as far as I know, but we're going to do iOS. And we don't need this guy open anymore. Just going to let this launch. It'll take a second. While it's going, we can, give our app a better title. Lord of the Rings, LOTR. It takes a minute to build usually the first time, but we'll get there. Meanwhile, I'm going to start cleaning some stuff out in my main.dart. I don't really need these instructions. We're also going to get rid of the entire my home page and its associated state. And instead of this saying my home page, let's just make this let's make it a scaffold for now so it doesn't look horrible. Okay, so it has built. I haven't saved yet, so we still have the old stuff that was there, but if I save now, we should see we have a pretty empty thing. Okay. So in our main.dart, we want to do a few things. Oops. We are going to start by let's theme this a little bit differently. Let's use indigo. Blue's kind of the default, and just to see how that looks, we'll just give this an app bar with a title of text. Hello. And then we get this nice indigo color instead of that default blue. But what we want to make is we're going to have tabs in this app. So we're going to go into our lib, and I'm actually going to make a new folder called screens. It's just, you can organize it however you like, but I like having a folder called screens. And here we're going to just call something root screen.dart. It'll be a stateless widget to start. We'll call it root screen, and we got to import a material. Easiest way to do that, Control space on the material widget, and it will auto import it for you there. Okay. What is next? So we are going to have a scaffold here, and let's just do that. And I'm just going to save, and let's go back to our main Dart so we don't forget. And instead of making our home page that thing right there, we're going to go root screen and go like that. So now we're working in here, and you'll see it's white, and that's just because we have an empty scaffold. One other thing I like to do early on is in here do debug check right here and make it false. Sorry, debug show checked mode banner. Just gets rid of that flag there. Okay, so within our scaffold, we are going to have an app bar, and it's going to have a title, text, and we could write, let's see if Lord of the Rings would fit. There we go. It fits well. I'm good. And then we are going to have a body, which for now I'm just going to stub in container. We'll get there in a minute. But we also want to put a bottom navigation bar, and this is how you can do a tab bar, a material tab bar, and it is of type bottom navigation bar. And we're going to have an on tap event to kind of like change the tabs, and I'll just make this an empty function for now and just pass in index here because it's expecting an index of whatever you tapped on. Current index is going to be equal to, we'll start with just 0, and then it's going to have some items in it, and these would be our 3 tabs. So we're going to start with making a bottom navigation bar item, and it's icon. Let's make it icon icons dot movie, I think is one. Yeah, and we can give it a label as well of just movies. And we will copy and paste that through, copy it once, paste it twice. Let's have movies, characters, and quotes. Those are the main resources we were talking about. So for this, I think person probably just makes the most sense. And cool, I think there's one for quotes. Format quote, that sounds about right. So now if we save, we see that we have these tabs here. Now they don't do anything yet, but they're there, and that's great. I'm going to add some extra commas, as you've seen me do before. Just kind of cleans up and makes everything indent really nicely. Okay, so because we are going to be doing something with changing the state of our screen, we are going to want to make this a stateful widget. So we'll just, to do that, Control Shift R on your main class, and you'll see that there's a helper here, convert to stateful widget. Okay, so we need a way to kind of have our different screens as part of this. So let us do some stuff here. First of all, let's just make one of those screens. I'm going to make a new screen called, we're going to start with, I think we'll start with, even though characters in the middle, I think we'll start with characters first. So we're going to call it character list screen dot dart. And I'm going to make a state list widget character list screen. And again, import control space, hit enter. And here we're just going to go and make text of hello. Now, this isn't a scaffold because this component's going to live within this scaffold. It's going to become the body, which right now we just have a container. It's going to become a body of this scaffold. So if we had another scaffold here, you'd have two headers. You'd have scaffold within a scaffold, and it would look really odd. So that's why we're doing that. So this is good enough for now. And in fact, maybe hello, we can just say character list screen, exclamation mark. Okay, so now that we have that, we're going to make a list of widgets that are going to be in each of these, and that will be a final variable. It's type list, and the list will be widgets within it, so we can do it like that. We'll call it children, and it's going to be equal to character list screen. And I'm just going to do this 3 times, even though this will change because we're going to have a movie list screen and a quote list screen. This will work for now, so we don't have to make all those screens. Then the other thing we need to track in our state is, this is something we track in our state. It's not going to be final. We're going to call it current index. And it's going to be equal to, we'll start with 1. So 0 is this, 1, 2, because let's just start on the character screen. So instead of setting 0 here, we'll use this variable. Then we have our onTap function that we can do. Now, what we can do here is all we really want to do when we tap is go set state and set that current index equal to index. Lastly, we need to deal with this body here. So the body is essentially just going to be whatever index we're on of the children. So we can simply just go children and then square brackets and do current index. All right, so we see character list screen in there. Now I can't prove 100% this is working unless we make another screen here. I guess we could kind of temporarily test that by just, instead of hitting a screen, do text, and we'll just do to do create movie list screen, and I'm going to do the same, create quote list screen. So now we'll see, let's refresh. Current index, set state, I just want to make sure everything is good. Yeah, on tap. Okay, character list screen. There we go. To do, create movie list screen. There's our character list screen, and a to do, create quote list screen. Awesome. Okay, we are a little bit off to the races here. What I want to do now is give you just a better idea of this API that we're going to be working with. So I've already set something up in Postman, and I'm going to upload it, and there'll be a link in the description so you can kind of have this, and probably with a few more things than I've sort of pre-put here, like for quotes, for example. And we're just going to take a look how this works. Now, when you do set this up, you will have to go into create an environment if you want to make use of these variables and create an API base URL. Now, the API base URL you can find from the docs and you'll see, I think if I search for V2, you'll see this is basically what I have pasted in a Postman. Secondly, if you when I created this, I set up, and you can go into the very top and see the setting or edit for this. And you can see I've set up authorization, which what we want to do is pass the word bearer with a space and then our API token, which I have hidden in my environment. So because I don't want, if everyone was using the same API token, it would get rate limited because it's not meant to be shared. Make your own. But basically, to hit movie, we just hit that endpoint and pass in that authorization, which is happening because the auth gets inherited from parent in Postman. And I'll make this a little bit bigger. And oops. And if we hit the movie endpoint, what you're going to do is we're going to see, okay, there's they have something at the high level. It is a map. It's a JSON object. Docs is one of the keys, and within docs it's an array of these movies, this movie item. So movies have an ID, a name, a runtime, award, score, that kind of stuff. And if I scroll all the way to the bottom, we will see that outside of that docs, so sibling of docs is a few more keys, total. So that's the total number of movies, no matter how many you have. There's a limit, an offset, a page, and pages. The ones we care about really are just docs, page, and pages, because from that information, if we know if we're on page 1 and it says there's 2 pages, we know, okay, there's potentially another page we could get. Really, we don't necessarily care about these things because our pagination is just going to worry about what page are we on right now and how many pages are there and what are the resources associated with that page. So that's the movies one, and characters, which is probably more relevant because that's what we're working on right now. As an example, we have again docs. It's the same thing, just a different characters have different properties such as height, race, gender, and wiki URL. The ones we're going to care about is ID. We want to keep ID so that we can kind of use it as a key. And I think for the purpose of this, just race and gender. A few other random things we could grab. Obviously, name is probably the most important, and then wiki URL because we might want to let our users go ahead and open this in a browser, which we will be doing. So that's kind of how it looks. So in order to sort of get stuff going, we're gonna do some fun stuff. So like I said, we're gonna be using something called Block, Flutter Block specifically. So just to take a look at it, and you can read through the docs. Essentially, if you have no idea what this is, it's comparable to something like Redux if you've used that. Essentially, what it's for is to kind of manage the state of your application so that you can make one API call and multiple screens could make use of the same data without having to go again. It's probably, I mean, and from a lot of the Flutter podcasts I listen to, some of the experts out there, they really say like, UI, that's simple. It's state management is where the real work is in creating an app. It's definitely where you'll spend the most time on something complex. We've done a bit of it before, at the very basic level, just on a stateful widget, you can just set state. That's kind of, state management of just that particular widget and all of its children. And then we've used Get It before, which is a nice sort of like singleton state management. And I still use that in many applications for managing, maybe your like users logged in state, that kind of stuff. We've also used Provider and Riverpod, which are also, I really like. Block is just something a little more involved, but it lets you have a really good application at the end of the day. It's very very nice to work with. Okay, so we're gonna need Flutter Block. So let's install that, and we can go back to our code, and I'll just kind of make it full, bigger screen for now. Try and zoom as much as I can without wasting too much stuff. But we can go Flutter pub add and then paste that in Flutter Block. While we're at it, there's probably a few more libraries we can add. So we're going to add something called Equitable, and Equitable works really well with well, it's kind of like a requirement. Usually, when you're doing the block pattern, it's essentially meant for kind of like querying differences between Um, I think I spelled it wrong. Yeah, it's equatable. Equatable. I think it's called equatable now that I actually read it. Equatable. It's going to get that. So it's meant for kind of like comparing differences in your state between models so that it doesn't have to, rebuild stuff if things are the same, but can also detect differences. We're also going to use something called Hive, and that's just a way that we can store stuff locally on our machine. Kind of like in theory, you can use it for like offline mode and that kind of stuff. What else do we need? We're just going to install Block as well. So Flutter Block is built on top of Block. So we will need Block. We're going to need something called DO, which we used, I believe, in the last thing it's just a really nice HTTP library. There we go. We got DO. And I think lastly, no, two more things. We're going to get hydrated block, and that's a way that we can kind of store, so what this kind of goes in line with using Hive and using Block, just a way to sort of hydrate, meaning have data, saved in memory in sort of like local storage, so that when you boot up your app, it can work off of what it has then. And lastly, we will need path provider so that we can get access to our temp directory, which is where we would be storing this hydration info. So a few things we've installed. Okay. Next up, we got that fun stuff out of the way. Okay, we're going to create a model. So actually, should we do character? Yeah, let's do characters. No, let's do quotes first. I feel like quotes are kind of like the most simple model. So I think we're going to start with quotes, meaning I'm just going to rename my character list screen to quote list screen. And you'll see that it actually, when you rename something in VS Code, generally it will update your path name. So that's really nice. Then we go to our quote list screen. Now I'm going to, rather than just renaming this here and having to find the other files, I can right click this and go rename symbol. And VS Code's really good at figuring out when you're referencing this from other places. So I can just change this to quote list screen. And it's going to go through my project and find stuff. And generally, if it's touching multiple files, in this case, it only touched two, you can do Command Alt S, and it will save all your open files. And now we're basically did a bit of a refactor. So here, and now the only thing I want to make a difference of is quote list screen is last in the way that we have our tabs, and that means I want to set current index to 2. Now, if we see this again, one thing we can do while I'm getting the next step set up, because we've installed quite a few things, there's definitely at least one of those libraries requires a full rebuild. So we are going to go stop and then Control F5, and we'll get that building in the background. Meanwhile, inside our lib, we're going to make a new folder called store. And inside store, we're going to make a new folder called quote. Eventually, there'll be a one for movie and one for what's the other one? Character, yeah. So let's make another new folder. We can make those ones after, but I want to make one called common, ones that all of our store things will use. Inside common, we will start with, let's make a new file called observer.dart. And this is essentially our block observer. And we're just going to call it simple block observer because it is really simple. And it's going to extend block observer. So I like to do it this way rather than just using block observer in our code. We can use this. That way we can make it really simple, but we can add more stuff later without having to do a major refactor. So inside here, we need to override a function that comes with block provider and with block observer, and that's the on transition. And it takes a block. Now, some of this stuff right now might not make any sense, and you're like, what are these things? They'll make a bit more sense after. And in fact, the observer, you don't really, once you kind of have it in place, you don't have to touch it anymore. And all we want to do is super.on transition, block transition. And similarly, there's an on error. I'm just going to copy and paste it because it's pretty simple. On error, and we want to call super.on error. Now it takes a block, but it doesn't take a transition. It takes an object, which is the error itself. and a stack trace so that we can stack trace it and learn what went wrong. And we need to just pass up those same things. So really, I mean, what I'm doing, stack trace. What I'm kind of doing here is just making what's called a shim. And actually, we'll print error here too. It doesn't like something about this. Oh, right, it's not block, it's block base that this inherits. If you were to look at block observer, you would see that the on transition method basically does the same thing, and same with this. This allows us to work with, instead of working directly with block observer, we can work with simple block observer, and I spelled this wrong, simple block observer. That way we can, do things like just add a print statement here or do some debugging or whatever else you might want to do in the future without making a change everywhere where we use block observer. So we're just kind of shimming this thing. Now, the reason for making this is in our main.dart, we're going to do some stuff before we run an app. So we're going to create something. We're going to create some stuff here. First of all, anytime you are updating some stuff in here, if you're not just running an app, it's a very good practice to do widgets flutter binding dot ensure initialize. I'm sure you've seen this in many projects. This just makes sure, okay, everything's ready to go before other things happen. What we're going to also do is get our temp directory, and we can get that from await get temporary directory, and that gets imported from path provider. We also have to make this async now, no problem. And then we can use Hive, which is that thing we installed that allows us to create a temp directory dot, just get the string version of our temp directory. So it's going to initialize in that temp directory so that we can take the other thing we installed called hydrated block and set its storage to hydrated storage dot build. We're going to build, and the storage directory is going to be that temp directory. So just a bit of setup there. Lastly, we're going to go block dot observer equals simple block observer. If we didn't do this, it would just be using the default one. So this just allows us to have our own, which ultimately doesn't make a huge difference, but it will in the future. So there's just some basic setup. We're going to bring this over here, make sure our app is still running. It is. Okay. Okay, the next thing we want to do in our common folder is we're going to make something called a response model. If you remember in Postman, we had this pattern where every time we got a response, where's Postman? It's wrapped in something called docs, and then there's a few other things like the limit, there's a lot here, sorry, total limit, offset page, pages. So this is used on all of our resources, which is why I'm putting in the common folder here. So this model, we're just going to basically make something to make it easier in the future to work with that JSON object. So we're just going to call it response list model. Yeah, sorry, I called it response model, and I'm going to keep the file name that because we might have a detail one as well. This is specifically for anytime we're getting a list of data back. And what we want to do, we're going to use something called generics that allows us to instantiate this model with a specific type of things, and you'll see that in a second. So there's going to be a few things here. We're going to have final int of total, and that's the total number of results. We're going to final int of limit. Actually, you know what? I did say before that there's only a few things we actually care about. It's really just page, pages, and docs, right? So let's not worry about the other one. If we realize we want them for something, we can add it in. So page, pages, and docs. Now, docs will not be an int, it is going to be a list. But what is it a list of? Well, it could be a list of movies. It could be a list of books. It could be a list of any of these things. And that's why we're doing this generic thing. So we can essentially, when we instantiate this, tell what kind of class this is. So this will be a list of, if we're instantiating it with movie, it could be a list of movies, etc. Then, because these are final, we need to instantiate them in the constructor. So we're just going to go like this and say, we're going to make sure these fields are required. So this dot page required this dot pages, required this dot docs. And that is, other than adding a semicolon here, and I like to have a comma here, so it's all clean. That is our response list model. Okay. Lastly, all of our different resources will have, a different service, a different block, a different repository. That's what we're going to be calling it in here, associated with it. However, they're all going to extend a common one so that we're not rewriting stuff from scratch every time to do the same things. So we're just going to call this API repository. And our API repository is going to do some things. First of all, let's make it. It's going to be an abstract class. We're never going to instantiate one on its own. We're only going to instantiate things that that extend it. So let's call it API repository. I hope I spelled that right. And when we instantiate, we need a couple things. We need to pass in a client, which will be of type DO. DO is that network library we're going to be using. And then when we do create it, we can make this a const API repository. We want to pass in this .client. We don't have to do required here because when we aren't using braces like that, it will it is just required when you have that. Now, if you wanted in general, when you're in Dart, if you do want an optional parameter, you put square brackets around it. And then you do have to set a default when it's not an nullable field, which this isn't. So just a small tidbit. Okay. All right, so we have that. Now in my, there's some similarities here to the last stream we did about building that grocery list. Something like this kind of already exists in there. And there's some helpers that I'm just going to pull them in from that project because they're essentially going to be the same. I don't want to type it all out. So this is just something that's going to convert our, when we pass in an object, we can convert it to query parameters. If you're interested in that, watch my other tutorial because I talk about it for a lot longer. So we have that helper there. There's some other helpers that I want to make as well, which we'll do in a bit. But the other thing that I'm going to pull literally from that same thing is my get method. So from that project, I'm pulling get. And this basically takes a path and then optionally takes some parameters. And we basically get the query by running that function we just wrote up here. Then we create the URL by taking our API base URL, path, and then query. Right, and then we pass in options here, which does not exist yet. Right, so because we're using authentication, we need to pass in some headers on all of our requests. So I'm going to create that here, and it's going to be private. That's why there's an underscore. It's just going to be a getter. So it is a function, but it doesn't take parameters, so we can make it a getter. So in here, we're actually going to return something called options, which is part of the DO library. And we're going to pass in headers, and the headers are going to be equal to, we're going to make one, and the key will be authorization. And then this is where we do that fun thing, bearer, and then we'd have our my API token here. And that's where you would paste in your API token if you're following along. Lastly, we need an API base URL. So let's just make that a constant, API base URL. And it is, let's go back to our lovely API. Here it is. And we're gonna just do it just as it is. So now you can see when we do it, we have then the path, then whatever our query is. And this is mostly all we need right now. We'll add some other things into here later. So there's our API repository. Okay. We're almost ready to do some real stuff. So inside here, we're going to create a bunch of files, but we'll make them one at a time. So we're going to make a quote. Let's start with the quote model.dart. And this will be a class called quote model. I've been recently, any of my models, I put model in the name just so it's really clear, because sometimes you have different, if you just call it quote, it can be kind of confusing. So I've just been starting to do this, and I like it. It's, a few extra letters to write, but it makes it really clear that you're talking about a model. Okay, so, and it is going to extend something. Normally I have, in the past, haven't really a lot of the time extended my core models. But in this case, because we're using block, we actually need to extend equatable, as we've learned it's called. Okay, quote model. And if we open up Postman, I do have, an example of a response here. Now, technically right here, I am, and we'll see this in a bit, I'm actually calling /movie / the ID of that movie / quote to give me quotes from that movie. But there's a similar endpoint that's just quote. But this works just as fine. So you can see there's an ID, there's a dialogue, there's movie, and there's character. Now, this is one annoying thing about this API. That the data that comes back isn't really serialized. It doesn't tell me what this movie is, so I have to kind of, and we'll get there in the future in a different way to find a better way to work with this. But we will store this stuff in our model. All right. So we want to basically make this stuff all line up so that we're working with this as a model and not just a JSON object. So we are going to have an ID. We're going to have dialogue, which is the actual text itself. We're going to store a string for the movie because right now, at least, it's just going to be a reference to that movie, and final string character, which is also just a reference to that character. And then as a constructor, we're going to make this quote model. And we're just going to make all these fields required, ID. To simplify things, I'm going to actually just get rid of movie and character right now. We can always add them later. Oops, this should say, sorry, this dot ID required this dot dialogue. Okay, then what we want to do is create what's called a factory. A factory is essentially a way you can construct something construct and kind of like return it all at once. So we can use the keyword factory, and we can go quote model dot from JSON. It's just a little bit different than maybe what you've seen before. This works a lot better with null safety. The problem with what we've done before is just kind of make it a static method. And the problem is you can't really instantiate one of these. This is just how we can get around all the, ensure nothing is ever null. So factory quote model from JSON. And usually what we would do if this wasn't a factory is we would just say like this dot ID equals that. But what we're actually going to do is return an instance of quote model where ID is equal to JSON ID. Now, the JSON response is actually underscore ID, but I don't want to have it that way because that would make it private. And dialogue, JSON dialogue. And we'll do that. Then, because we're extending equitable, you'll see there's a little error happening here, equatable. We can just do quick fix and create this missing override. So there's an override we need to do. And with equatable, the things that essentially it is going to be comparing against would be the ID and the dialogue. So we're just returning an array of those things. And that's just something we have to do when we extend equatable. You need to have a props function here. So those are the properties of the model meant for all of our state management stuff. Okay, we have a model. That's great. And of course, like we may add in movie and character later, and we just have to add it here, and add it here, and then add them here, assuming we want them to be comparable. Okay, so that's our model. Let's make the repository next. So quote repository.dart. Okay, now this will be fun. So we're going to create something called quote repository. And it's going to extend that API repository that we made previously. We do need to have DO as a client as the final property, so we instantiate this. And thus, we can do this as a constant, quote repository constructor, this dot client, and then we want to go, because we're extending something, we need to go super client. So essentially what is happening when we instantiate, when we make a new one, we're going to be setting this one. And then when it creates, it's going to be setting its parent, which is API repositories client. So that's all we have to do there. Okay, now we're going to create a method in this repository. It is going to be of type future because it's going to be making an API request and it needs to, it's not going to happen instantly. And this future is going to return something. Specifically, it's going to return a response list model that we made. And if you remember the response list model, we need to pass in what kind of response it is. If we can see this response list model, oops, I'll just open it up instead. Response model. So you see, we need to tell it what the T is in this case. And so we can do another opening Pacman, and it is going to be quote model. That's the one we just made. Make sure we have 2 of these closing guys, and we're going to call this fetch quotes. And there's some properties that we're going to essentially pass into here. We're going to allow a page, what page we're on, and by default, if it isn't passed in, so we're not going to make it required. We're just going to set a default, which kind of makes it required because when you don't pass something in, it sets it to a default value. So default is page. Let's also pass in limit, and let's set a limit of 20. And this function is asynchronous, so we have to say async. And then we actually run the function. So final, we're going to create something called params. And it's going to be equal to, in this case, let's do page, and limit. So this is just like a nice object that we can work with to do our request. And then we're going to get our data. So we can just go final data equals, and we're going to await this. And we can do this.get. Now this.get, there's no function in here called get, but remember we are extending API repository and we have a function called get right here. There we go. It's blue, and that's just because it's technically a reserved word, but you can still, in certain programming languages, use reserved words in specific situations, such as naming a function that. So we'll say this.get, and this.get takes a path. So in this case, we're going to pass in quote because that's the according to the docs where we want to be hitting, and we're also going to pass in those parameters. So those are our parameters there, which will through this we have our path. We take that base URL, we combine it with the path, and then we pass in query, which is essentially this function turning that into a string. That nice object that we made that's really nice to work with eventually becomes page equals 1 and limit equals 5 or whatever kind of thing. So we don't want to write it like that. We want to work with a nice friendly way like this. Okay, so we pass in those. That just gets us our data. What we want to do is transform that data into the models that we've made. So we're going to create a final, and it's going to be a list of type quote model. And we're going to just call it docs because that's kind of what their documents, like that's what their API is called. So within data, when we made this, we should be getting a key back called docs, which looks like this, docs. Now we don't just want it to be that because that would just be a string representation or a JSON object, like a map of that stuff. What we want to do is actually convert them to our lovely model that we've made. So we want to map within them. And we want to just say what type will be coming back so that our IntelliSense and everything doesn't complain. Then we pass in a function. Now in the map, we have doc. So this is going to basically, when we do map, it's going to loop this function for every item that's in there. And it's going to give us a reference called doc. And what we actually want to return is a new quote model. And we can do that, use that lovely function we made, that factory called from JSON, and just pass in the JSON. Now the JSON in this case is whatever is in that doc. So we're just passing in doc. And then at the very end, because we need it to be a list, we just go .toList. And there you have it. Lastly, we need to return, this needs to conform to this. It's already conforming to a future because it is an asynchronous function, but we need to return ultimately from this a response list model. So we can do that very easily by going return response list model, and let's pass in some stuff. So the page will be data page. The pages will be data pages. And docs will be, hey, it did it for us. Look, docs, which we have already made here. And we'll just put a little comma there. And there we go. So this should return, a nicer representation, something we can work with a lot better for this. Okay, we're almost there. I think we're almost there. A bit more, but we have a good chunk of the quote stuff in place. Now we get into more the block side of quote. So let's see. Let's start with the event. It's the simplest one. So we're going to make something called quote event.dart. So events are basically we're going to have a way to, these are kind of like in Redux, like actions, if you use Redux, a way that we can kind of name specific functions we want to go, and then we can have listeners to work with them as needed. So let's make that, and we're going to start by making an abstract class called quote event. And this is where all of our other types of events will to do with quote will become part of it. It's going to extend equatable. And of course, we need to, when we're extending equatable, we need to override the props function, which is a list. It'll be return a list object, get props. And in this case, we're just doing, we're not returning anything because really we're never going to instantiate a quote event on its own. What we are going to instantiate is perhaps a function like quote fetched. And it is going to extend quote event. And we're not even going to do anything with this. We're just extending it so that we can work with it. We might have another one in the future too called, and I'll make it now, quote reset fetched. For instance, when we want to clear, do a full reload and query from scratch. So I've kind of created those. If this on its own doesn't make much sense, just think of it as like these are different actions that our block pattern will use for quotes specifically, and it'll make more sense when we have all the other pieces in. That's our event. I am going to also just make a new file right now called quote block. And we're going to put a bunch of stuff in here, but I want to start by, first of all, connecting the dots between these things. So we can use something called part, and we're going to do quote event.dart. And then over in quote event, we can write part of quote block, block.dart. Did I mix those up? No, I don't think so. Oh, right. So, okay, so basically what part and part of does, you can kind of create, I created a package here, and I'm going to import. We will eventually need equatable in here. I'm going to import equatable here. Part, and as far as I know what part and of part, it's kind of like you can make multiple files that all feel like they're the same file. So rather than having a really long file with all this stuff and importing similar things, we can essentially connect the dots between these two things. So I have made this, I can get rid of this now. So you'll see I'm not actually importing equatable, but it somehow like knows what it is. And that's because we're saying part of quote block, and quote block is importing equatable. So it's nice, just a nice pattern for when you have a lot of files that are kind of like intertwined and connected. Let's just have, rather than put in one file, we can still use separate files, but get the advantages otherwise. So before we finish up quote block, let's make quote state. And quote state will be part of quote block dot dart. And we need to go to our quote block and then connect it by saying part, just part, not part of, quote state. So we kind of have these three files, block, event, and state, all part of the quote, all kind of like intertwined and connected as if they are the same thing. Okay, in our quote state, so state this is kind of like what represents our applications, this resource's state in this case. It's going to kind of remember what's in the list, and it can eventually do other things, as you will see. So we're going to make that, we're going to call it quote state, and it's going to extend equatable. And we're going to have a constructor, and it can be a constant constructor, quote state. And we are going to have some things that we do in there, but we'll just keep it empty for now. Furthermore, there's some stuff we need to kind of think of this as like, I mean, this is kind of our store. This is our, if you're thinking Redux, this is like I forget the term right now, but it's where how we kind of remember our data and the way it's laid out. So we are going to have a list of quote models, and we'll do that, and we'll just call it quotes. Now, another thing we're going to need, just the way that we're going to be dealing with pagination, is we also want to remember what were the most recent. If we made, page 1, page 2, we essentially want to know, okay, which ones were just added. If we are only remembering our quotes, if we just keep appending that on, our list is just going to keep exponentially getting bigger, because it's going to kind of do, let's say we grabbed A, B, and C. The next call, we'd be grabbing D, E, and F. But if we just told our list to append pages from the original, it would be A, B, C, A, B, C, D, E, F. If that makes any sense. So we want a way to remember, like, what are the most recent ones that we actually, got here. We're also going to have something called status. Now, status is something that we can actually put in our common files here. I'm going to make actually, we're going to put this right in our API repository. So I'm going to make an enum. And it's going to be called API request state. And it is going to have a few different things. It's going to have success, the first one, initial. So that means like it's doing the first one. It's like going to do the first. Success, meaning it was successful, or failure. The reason I'm putting it here is because it will be used by multiple resources that we made. So we can just now put here API request. So I called it state. That should have actually been status. So let's do our little rename symbol. And it changed it there, we're good. Okay, so we have a status. We also want to remember what page we are on, so that when we get the next page, we can just be like page +1. And then we want to know how many pages there are of this resource. Okay. Then within here, we are going to instantiate in our constructor this .quotes, and we're going to give it a default in case we don't pass anything in, and it's going to be an array, but specifically, just so everything works and everything knows, it is an array of quote models. Similarly, and we can just copy and paste that. This should say appended quotes, I think. Yeah. This appended quotes. We want to say this status, and by default, it's going to be API request status initial, because we're just initializing it. This page, let's just set it to 0, and this page is also 0, because we don't know anything about it yet. Okay, so that's kind of the main thing about our quote state. We have a little error here. Let's see, it's missing the method, right? Because we're extending equatable, we do need to grab back. We need to do this override. So let's use this helper here. Quick fix, create the missing thing, and we want to, similar to what we've done before, we want to return, in this case, the status, the quotes, the appended quotes, pages. I think that's it. And semicolon. So we have that. Okay, and then lastly, with our state, we do need to essentially have, so the way kind of like the comparables and stuff work is we need a way that we can, when we update the state, take the existing state as it is now and make certain changes to it. Without having to completely rewrite it from scratch, which would slow down all your build methods and everything if it was a completely new instance. We just want to do essentially a copy with. So we're going to create that by going quote state copy with, and we're going to be passing in the different things that we could that could be sent in. So API request status. And we're going to make these all optional, because the idea is we want to be able to copy with without passing everything in. It's kind of like the difference between a patch and a put on an API request. We only want to pass in maybe certain things. So we'll do the question mark here. We'll call it status. Similarly, we're going to have a list of quote model, also optional, called quotes. And I will copy that to do appended quotes. Then we want an integer, also optional of page, integer, also optional of pages. then inside this constructor, we are going to, anytime you create this, we're going to return a new instance of quote state. And what we want to do is pass in all these things. So for instance, we want to pass in status, and we're going to say status, but status could be null. So when it is null, when it isn't passed in, we want to take whatever our current status is. So we can do that with the double question mark and just go this dot status. So it's basically going to go, okay, if a status is passed in, it's going to use status. If not, it's going to use this dot status. And this goes along with all the null safety stuff. We know that it's null safe because ultimately this dot status will always never be null, because when it's not created initially, it's set to an initial thing. And then if it's not passed in here, it will just use whatever was there before. Okay, and we're just going to copy and paste this and kind of go quotes. And I think we can just do this for appended quotes as well. A lot of copying and pasting, but it's very good. Make this a pages, sure, and page. And there we go. We have our state. Oh, there is one difference here. When we are doing and this is the reason we kind of have the whole like appended quotes. We want to do, whenever appended quotes is actually null, we're going to just set it back to an empty array, so that, because we don't want when another request happens to just say like, oh, there wasn't any appended quotes. All right, let's set it back to what it was before. That kind of breaks the whole point of this. And if that doesn't make any sense, it will hopefully as we actually start doing the pagination part of things, which we are almost at. Okay, there's one more important thing to make, is the block, which kind of ties all these things we just made together. And then lastly, we'll be going into actually making the screen that lists them with all the pagination and stuff. Since we're about at an hour now, I think this is a good time to take a quick break, and we'll continue off in the next video.